Thank you, Francois. It's a pleasure being here. I'm here this morning in the place of Lance Bosflug, who sends his warm regards and looks forward to being with you next year. The next session for today is operational effectiveness. When you reflect on the accident statistics we saw before lunch, with CFIT leading the way, I think we can agree that this is probably some of the most important work that we're doing. The three streams we'll be talking about today are FCOM, HTAWS, and EBT. Somebody advance the slide forward, please. These were agreed back in 2004 in Lisbon, and they're as important today as they were back then. And I think you'll find out over the next hour that considerable progress is being made. The majority of this session will be led by Tim Rolfe, Director of Safety and Global Safety Assurance at Bristow, and Pat Attaway, Director of Global Standards at PHI. Both these gentlemen have contributed a lot over the last year, and I want to especially recognize their contributions. You will see on this slide behind me that the Workstream follows a fairly logical process of technical development, analysis, recommendations, leading to an implementation, and then monitoring performance. I want to focus in my brief remarks on implementation. I think it's critically important that we get to the finish line. And as an example of that, we're not going to get the safety benefits out of an FCOM that's still a draft. HTAWS is not going to produce or save an accident from occurring if it's still in the testing phase. And EBT can't really add value until it's been transformed into new training standards and programs that are approved in our industry. Also behind me on the wall is the phrase safety through collaboration. And I think collaboration is going to be absolutely required for us to get across that finish line. And not only collaboration, but collaboration that leads to different thinking. For example, we all know how difficult it is in our organizations, which are leaner than they've ever have been, to process, for example, an amendment to our OMA and then get that approved by a regulator that's already under-resourced. So if you think about FCOM, it's a daunting task. Tim will lay out for you shortly the approach that HeliOffshore will be recommending to get to success. However, I would encourage all of the stakeholders in the room, operators, customers, regulators, to think about how you can influence that process. Are there different paths we can go down? Can we apply different thinking? Are there different ways of working together so that we can move with urgency towards implementation? How can we draw on more resources that perhaps we're not using today? And especially as operators and also as regulators, we need to be honest with ourselves about the amount of resources that are required in order to do this. Pat thereafter will provide an overview of EBT, or evidence-based training, and the way forward for HeliOffshore and its members. This is a critically important area. I think it's going to be powerful for our industry, but it's complicated, and I don't think it's that well understood. And in drawing that conclusion, it comes with some experience. Over the past year, PHI invested about 9 months looking at EBT, understanding the regulatory environment, looking at the requirements, doing our initial threat analysis, and then planning a way forward. It was a huge amount of work, and all we have is a foundation stone. And now we've got to build a house on top of that. We'll be sharing that work with HeliOffshore very shortly, and hopefully it adds some value to the work that they're going through at the moment. But getting to a full EBT implementation, which is comparable to that in the fixed-wing world, is going to take a long time. So, I'd like to challenge all of us in the room is how can we make incremental improvements along the way as we're learning, as we're moving forward? Can we make step changes in the way we are training our workforce that gets us value as we go through the process, one step at a time? And we should bear in mind, as we're making those improvements, the training standards that we will be updating or replacing have been in place for a very long time. And perhaps many of them are not supported by empirical analysis as they will be in the future. Concerning HTOS, we'll get an update from Sikorsky and Leonardo on the progress in that area. That's a very important area for all of us. And here is an example of different thinking at work. We had OEMs come together to work together, collaborate, invest in something for the benefit of the industry rather than investing for competitive advantage. And our customer base came with us with their investment. So we thank all of those parties for their contributions. Thank you for your attention, and I'd like to welcome Tim to the stage.
Thank you very much, Keith. Good afternoon, everybody. It's always a pleasure to come here and give you an update on the Workstream, remembering that it was the combined HeliOffshore membership that set out what our priorities were going to be back in 2015. It's difficult following lunch, but over lunch I was thinking about what Matthew Pinson said about the rewards associated with joint achievement, and it made me think about our combined achievements. I'm talking about the achievements that Matthew Pinson and I have combined. Between us, we've got 4 Olympic gold medals, a 500-metre swimming badge, and a cycling proficiency certificate. And when I think about our joint efforts, I'm pretty pleased about that. I'm sure Matthew Pinson's in the car on the way to the airport reflecting in exactly the same way. But we can't claim credit from each other's achievements, of course, but we should be proud to recognise where genuine collaborative effort has delivered success, and that's very much the case in the operational effectiveness workstream. I'd like to underline the expanded focus that Keith talked to in his opening slide, that we have to look beyond developing technical solutions. We have to create the framework that enables and drives effective implementation, creating transparency across our industry, and we have to monitor and measure real safety performance on the front line. So those of you who are less familiar with our workstream, this is the safety performance model that Gretchen showed earlier on, a model that requires us to demonstrate success through performance improvement. We're focused in these areas. We want to avoid aircraft upset, and we do that by looking at consistent flight path management, effective use of automation, and enhancing situational awareness. We want to avoid surface and obstacle conflict, and we do that by enhancing our warning systems and improving our crew training. Previously, we've talked about the independent substreams of operational effectiveness, perhaps separately. FCOM, EBT, eye tracking, flight path management, and HTORs. We focused on them separately. But following the presentation from Matt, you can see and get an awareness of the growing maturity of the HSIP program. That's now the glue that potentially joins each of these sub-work streams together. They're now capable of feeding into and off each other. And together, they help us to address our priority risks, which, as you see there, system failure, loss of control, and as many people correctly guessed earlier on, our highest priority, controlled flight into terrain. Between them, they make up over 60% of our fatal accidents. So today, we're just updating on 3 of those sub-work streams, FCOM, HTORs, and EBT. Let's first look at FCOM. For those of you who are new to conference, we ask ourselves, why FCOM? Well, we know it can save lives. We want to address avoidable accidents where mismanagement of automation is a causal factor. We've seen accidents in the fixed-wing community, and we could see we were exposed to the same. And we set out to expand our crew's knowledge and understanding of their autopilot systems, and we set out to increase levels of collaboration and information exchange between our operators and our OEMs, and we've been pretty successful at doing that. Together, we created our HeliOffshore briefing sheet, and the workstream was born. That's a bit about our history, but let me let 1 or 2 others talk about our history and our future. It's Saturday, it's after lunch, it's warm outside. Why wouldn't we dim the lights a little and get you to watch a video? Can we run the video, please?
Effective flight path management is a key factor for safe offshore helicopter operations. Automation technology in aircraft can make a positive difference. Complete understanding by flight crew of how the designers intended automation to be used makes flight path management even safer. And so too does achieving operational standardization. This is where the implementation of flight crew operating manuals can bring tangible safety benefits. They get everyone on the same page and clear as to how to maximize the safety features of each aircraft. Operator experience and operational data clearly support the case for using FCOMs, and key oil and gas industry stakeholders support this too.
The aircraft that we're operating today have become more and more complex as time goes by. A lot more automated systems, computers and electronic systems that operate along with the flight crew. And the FCOM really pulls together the design requirements that they had for the aircraft and how they want that technology utilized in the aircraft. And the FCOM puts that all together for the flight crew to be able to maximize the efficiency out of the aircraft.
But we wanted to keep it automation-centric because that's where our biggest challenges are in terms of accidents, was the management of the automation and effective use of automation in flight path management. So if pilots have a better understanding of the philosophy and how it works, then you don't have that what's it doing now moment. The FCOM really covers a few gaps that exist today. Most helicopter operators would say, look, we have an RFM, a rotorcraft flight manual. That gives us everything we need, combined with our current standard operating procedures. The problem that they have with that is that the RFM was really designed around certification of the aircraft by the manufacturer at the time they built and designed the aircraft. And it doesn't cover a lot of the operating aspects of what a pilot should do with the automation, how to fly it. So the FCOM is really closing the gap between the design philosophy, what the designer thought at the time, how it would link button pushes with automation output to the pilot in an easy to read format.
We want a pilot, whether he's flying for one operator or another, to be flying it in exactly the same way so that when they move between companies, there's no change in the way they operate the equipment, a lot of which is very complex and needs years to get thoroughly proficient on. There are still going to be different roles and there's going to be some differences in the way they operate, but having the FCOM as the basis is going to mean that standardisation is much greater. We believe FCOMs are going to be critical because they're going to prevent accidents in the short run. We want our aircraft to be flown in a standardised way and in the way in which the OEM that designed them intended them to be flown.
I think that the FCOM was introduced quite a long time in the fixed wing area, and it was definitely a tool to be introduced in the helicopter world as well, because actually between what was publishing the manufacturer and what was using the operator, there was a kind of gap that they have to translate the manufacturer procedure into their own procedures. So I think that the FCOM is a good tool in betweens to give the good guidance, and more accurate for the helicopter operator, which is a good thing.
The manufacturers have made a lot of effort, huge effort over the last 2 years, and Leonardo have produced FCOMs for the 139, which is now currently in service. The 189 is currently being reviewed by the operators. Airbus have done a great job on the 175, and they have obviously from the 225 where they learnt a lot of lessons and they've been able to deploy those in the 175. Sikorsky has done the 76 and the 92, so they both have FCOMs which exist on their 360 platform. And the good news is that Bell Helicopters of the 525, it's in the pipeline and they've accepted that they're going to run with FCOMs, which is a perfect situation for us because we have all the designers and the development of this aircraft right at the early stage, so we're very excited by that. One thing to note, because it's quite new to this industry, is an FCOM isn't delivered as a finished product. It's going to be an iterative process, probably about a 5-year process of working backward and forward with the manufacturers and the helicopter operators to get the FCOM in a position that's acceptable to the majority of the operators, because parts of it now will work with some operators and some parts won't work with other operators. So we're trying to bring those two bodies together to make sure we're in sync on what a good FCOM looks like.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Charles and the comms team and all of the participants for putting that video together. There are two key messages in there. One is that we are and we remain committed to developing FCOM as an industry, but we're also focused on creating the framework for effective implementation and adoption. And we've got two speakers now who are going to expand on those points for us. First is Alan Walling, who's going to talk about recent efforts to standardize FCOM structure and format. Many of you recognize Alan, of course, in his role working for one of our OEMs, but today Alan isn't representing his employer, he's representing the recently formed FCOM steering committee, So ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you Alan Warning, the people's representative.
Well, hey, welcome everybody, and I'm really glad to be here. And as Tim said, Alan Walling from Sikorsky, but today I talk to you as a member of HeliOffshore. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. This is a new phrase, FCOM Steering Committee. And by the way, the only thing I have in common with the Olympiad is that I have about 5 minutes and 46 seconds to get through my slides. So other than that, I have no other sporting capability whatsoever. As evident, a couple of years ago when I made it 10 minutes in a flag football game before breaking my leg. So anyways, a little bit of background. Each of the, Tim showed each of the OEMs. We have our FCOMs. We've been working on them for a few years now. Most of us have either like revision 1 or revision 2 that's out there. I guess that one wasn't working. Good. And, the battery was dying. So we were all out there working our own, but, and we had the high-level guidelines that we had gotten from HeliOffshore. Here's what, Section 1, Section 2, Section 3 should be. But we didn't really have there wasn't a lot of guidance, rightfully so, as to what, went into Section 1, Section 2, Section 3. What should it look like? And we had a meeting last October, actually right after the solar conference in Stavanger, and all the OEMs and some members of the HeliOffshore team, and we were talking about the FCOM, we were talking about FCOM implementation, and we were talking about the feedback that we were either getting or were going to be getting. And we were a little concerned about that, and we said, we probably should put some standardization around how we format the FCOM so that when we get the feedback, we're getting feedback that we can enact throughout all the FCOMs. Now, I'll tell you straight up that at that time in October, I was against it. I'm like, no, I said, we've been working on ours, we've got it, it's out there. We just give us the feedback and we'll move forward. But, further talking about it, and we set up a meeting, and I'll tell you the epiphany moment was at that meeting in April, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we agreed to meet to talk about content structure or standardization. How can we collaborate to make it easier for the implementation of the FCOM? So that led to a meeting that we had at the beginning of April. And I want to say thank you to Leonardo. They hosted it at probably one of the nicest places in the world. Their training facility is located in Sesto Calende in northern Italy, right on the southern border of Lake Como. That's where I would pick to put a training facility. And everybody was there. Leonardo, Airbus, Bell, Sikorsky. We had a representative from Bristow, from Babcock, and of course HeliOffshore. But really, and this was really key, a key observation I took right from the beginning, and it's what changed my mind on this whole thing, was that right from the start, 9 a.m. on the first day, it wasn't any one of those individual organizations talking. We were talking as one team, HeliOffshore, one team. How can we get a standardized approach to make it easier for the operators? And at first, we didn't want the operators or HeliOffshore there. We just wanted the OEMs. We're going to go do our thing, and then we'll tell you what it is that we come up with. And we quickly realized that that was the wrong approach. And I want to say thanks to Francois. He brought Simon Fielding and Dave Denham into the mix, and it was absolutely critical, it turned out, having that operator input. It made the meeting night and day. And we all worked together to come up with what we're going to do. And it was about halfway through on the first day, I looked up from what we were doing. I'm like, what we really have here is the steering group for how the FCOM should be not only deployed, but how are we going to continue this going forward in the future. So let's call ourselves the FCOM Steering Committee or FCOM Steering Group, and let's outline those things that we feel that we need to be doing in order to make this successful for the greater group. That's like determining what the contact structure would be like without impacting the innovation that can go into the FCOM. So we're just going to say, okay, we'll agree on what the structure looks like, but each OEM gets to choose how they're going to go implement that. and then reviewing and approving feedback. This was really key because we're all getting feedback in from the operators. Well, you know, we like the way that this word says, or we like how this phrase says, but that's all coming in individually. So what we need is we need a body that is reviewing all that so that we can make sure that all of that is being implemented the same across all the different models. And then let's put together and maintain a roadmap that says here's the things that we're going to do over time going forward. So you can't be a steering committee without having a purpose and a mission statement. So we took about 30 minutes and we came up with, okay, well, what is it that we're actually trying to do here? Well, we know what the FCOM is, right? We want to be able to recommend the practices that provide the flight crew with guidance on how to operate the aircraft. But really, what's our mission statement? We want to encourage that commonality for development and implementation so that everybody in the user community says, yeah, this is the way to do it, and we're on board, and we're going to move forward. So it wouldn't be a steering committee if we didn't actually have, you know, here's the actions that we took and who owns it and when we're going to get it done by. So obviously the first action is we established ourselves. That was quick. But that next one there are 3 words, adopt FCOM guidelines. That took 2 days. That was 2 days of the best collaboration I've seen in the 3.5 years I've been part of this organization. Just everyone shared their content, everybody shared how they're doing it, and then we looked across those 4 platforms and said, here's the best way that we should do that. Not all, I'm going to stick with mine, and you guys, you know, exactly what Matthew Pinsent said before, right? It's not, oh, this is how I'm going to row and everybody follow me. We didn't do that. It was, hey, this is how I row. How do you row? Well, I row this way. Oh, well, that's a slightly better way than I do it, so let's implement that. And that was what was great about those 2 days. We also talked about coordinating with EASA. We've actually gotten some preliminary info supplied to EASA on what we're doing because we heard that they wanted to create a working group on this, but they've actually gotten some feedback to us that says, you know what, you guys might be out ahead of us, so we don't need to create a working group, which is, I think, really good. The next thing we're working on is common phraseology, and I'm sure that everybody in here has at least 2 or 3 opinions on what something should say. Talk to a pilot, it might be more than 2 or 3 opinions. But, you know, we're working that. We have another telecon coming up in the next few weeks. And we chose also to do a feedback review every 6 months. This way here, it brings some structure and some order into that. And then we're setting up our structure for our committee meetings, which we'll do 1 a quarter on a telecon and then every 6 months in person. So my get off the stage slide, this is just the group that was out there in Italy. I want to say thank you again. Big shout out to Dave Denman from Bristow and Simon Fielding from Babcock. Dave stepped up and he's our chairman. I was the self-appointed spokesman because when we went around the room, I was the only one in the picture that was actually coming here. So by default, you know, they're like, oh, well, who's going to do this? Well, Alan, you're the only one coming, so you're doing it. So that's fine, but I have no problem being the spokesman for the team. Again, I just want to say thank you to everybody. It was a great collaborative effort. It really demonstrated what it is that we're all about and what we're trying to do going forward. So thank you, Tim.
Great, thank you. Okay. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, genuine collaborative effort right there. Our second speaker is Pat Attaway, who's the Director of Global Standards at PHI. Pat's also a very active member of the Operational Effectiveness Workstream. He's on the HeliOffshore Safety Steering Group. And when he's not sleeping, he's also chair of the Helicopter Safety Advisory Conference, the Operator Safety Initiatives Group in the Gulf of Mexico. Pat's going to talk about FCOM implementation from an operator perspective. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks, Tim. Good afternoon or morning or evening, whatever time zone you're from. So I am a little jet lagged. My wife is also, she's out on the bus with the tours, and I said, find a buddy. So if you fall asleep and start snoring, they elbow you. So if someone's at your table snoring, elbow them, be a good table occupant. So I'd like to talk to you about FCOM implementation a little bit from the operator standpoint. I also want to recognize J.J. Gerber from Cougar, who's also a big part of this group. And he and I speak often in collaborative efforts of trying to develop the roadmap and how do we get things implemented. A while back, if you remember, a lot of you were asked to do a survey. And so we sent out the survey about where are you in implementation. And JJ and I got on the phone with a lot of you. Hey, have you answered the survey? So there's a lot of that goes on. But a big part of what we learned about in those discussions was how in the heck do operators actually implement the FCOM? I was talking to one of my colleagues in my office, and I was talking to him about the challenge of an FCOM and implementing. And he said, it's a little bit like building a house, remodeling a house that you're living in, isn't it? So there you are, you've got everything set up, you've got all of your programs, you know where the bathroom is, you know where your bedroom is, and suddenly everything's going to change. So you've got to go out and get the new designs, you've got to go get somebody to approve your designs, you got to start tearing out walls, you got to start putting them back in, oh, by the way, while you're still living there. And from an operator perspective, that's kind of what implementing FCOM is going to be about for us. And also, when we were talking in Atlanta as the group, we said we really need to do a little bit better job of communicating the roadmap of how to implement and what to implement for the team. So this is the roadmap that was actually developed sitting at the table and thinking about this. Over on the left-hand side, where we start, we see the actual initial FCOM development. That's the mind spring of let's putting these things together. That's the first iteration. And we go all the way to the right to the final release, which, I think, Francois, you're right. It's probably going to be 5 years or so down the road before we get to that. So we're somewhere in the middle of that. Going from the left side, the next block we see, if you can read that in the back, is the pre-release revisions where OEMs have actually put out FCOMs. And by the way, while the FCOMs are still being worked on for standardization, what they look like, we as operators and we as HeliOffshore have gotten what we've asked for. Initially, we asked OEMs, tell us about your automation, because we knew that's where we were having problems. Tell us about your automation, tell us how it works, and tell us how you expect it to use in different phases of flight. Taxi, takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, approach. Tell us how you envisioned that automation to work. And while all the FCOMs are not standard, we have that today. So, okay, the OEMs have delivered on their request, and they'll continue to develop it, but now it's in our hands as operators. So now we have initial revisions where you can see under there, operator gap analysis. That's where we would recommend that operators start looking on how to implement. We all, most of us, I guess, really are operating the various aircraft where we have FCOMs today. But you have what the OEM is saying to do, and you have what you're actually doing. Start doing that gap analysis. Start documenting the differences that are there. And where you can, actually start implementing those. So we know the process. You've got to actually think it up. You've got to write it down. You've got to document it. Oh, yeah, you got to go to the regulator. You've got to get their buy-in on that. You've got to put together your training programs. And there's a whole bunch of guys called pilots who've got to be educated on that. And then you got to make it all work. So, but it's got to start. It's got to start with that gap analysis. What are the differences between what we're doing today and what we need to do tomorrow? And where you can implement, and that's where we go to the circular portion, where you can implement, and where you can't, let us know. Let us here at HeliOffshore know, myself or Tim or JJ, let us know what you can. We'll actually start asking for that, because who needs to know that something can't be implemented? The OEM needs to know something can't be implemented, because they either need to tell us why, hey, this is really important, you need to go and do this, or, yeah, okay, I understand, let's take that out of the FCOM. So that in the iterative process, 5 to 10 years down the road, but hopefully sooner, we actually have good, mature FCOMs. So you can see that process where We'll have continued surveys, trying to figure out where we are, what's working, what's not, and that will allow us to develop the focused revisions of the FCOMs. So here's the roadmap. It's up on the HeliOffshore website. If you look for it, it's there. So we now have a roadmap. And the key that I would say around this is around automation. The things that were intended to help us, give us the guidance of automation is there. It's there today in the FCOMs. It takes a little work in some cases to ferret it out, but that's where we feel we should start in our implementation roadmap. So with that, you need to know what FCOM's out there. So we thank to all the OEMs for helping us to update. This was updated just really days ago. The FCOM status table, which will be on the HeliOffshore website. We know who the OEMs are. We know the helicopter types. We know the stage gate process they're in as we go through the stage gate process of the program. But for us, we also know the status. And if you look, it says FR, ID. FR, most of the books, FCOMs are in that, meaning post-release, feedback required. So the FCOMs have been delivered. We need to start implementing, and we need to provide that feedback. And we can do that through HeliOffshore, or if you're so inclined, directly to OEM. But if we can collect all that information and then provide it in feedback, I think it'll work a little bit better that way. So the FCOM status table is there. So recommended practice for FCOM implementation. Where there's one published, we ask you to go back to the FCOM briefing sheet that's up on the HeliOffshore website. Go get that. It's really about automation. But take your FCOMs that you have, identify and incorporate relative sections into the operating procedures, both normal and operating procedures, and identify what can be done and what can't be done. And let's get on with it. I pledge my support within my organization to help guide the teams through that. I would ask that within each one of your organizations, you designate someone who is the champion for that and help to educate your teams on what implementation actually looks like in this iterative stage. All right, with that, all right, poll EV. So we're going to ask everybody to pull out your smart devices, and we're going to do a poll EV here. However, because we're time constrained here, we're not going to pull up the answers right now. We're going to do that a little bit later. We're going to turn it over. But I would ask you in discussion your poll EV so we can get this documented. What's the main action you and your organization need to take away to ensure full implementation of the proposed FCOM recommended practices? What can you do? We all have to look at it and make a commitment that if we're going to get to FCOMs being in use, we have to start. So that's our roadmap. That's an update on where we are. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Pat. That's great. So those are our next steps, using the workspace to collaborate further, giving good visibility of each of the stages that Pat talked about, and then ultimately using the safety program to monitor our performance changes. Let's roll into the next session, which is talking about a summary of enhanced HTORs. So why HTORs and why enhancing them? Well, we know that by improving HTORs and alerting crews sooner, we can potentially avert surface impact accidents. And remember that CFIT is a significant industry risk for us. So where are we? If we recall, the HTORs enhancement project was split into two phases. The first was to enhance existing warnings, what we refer to as mode 1 to 6. They're on most of our aircraft already. We also wanted to add a mode 7, which would give increased warning times, some cases of up to 18 seconds in low speed, low power scenarios. And the second phase of the program was to enhance the effectiveness of those warnings by improving the system interface, how crews heard and saw those warnings in the cockpit. Well, since the last AGM, there have been numerous meetings, calls and discussions around progress, very enthusiastically attended and developed. And the net outcome is that the mode 1 to 6 enhancements have been agreed by all of our OEMs. And the project's moving forward to deliver what we believe to be about 60% of the net safety benefit by delivering mode 1 to 6 enhancement on the 139 and the S92 fleets. The mode 7 development was a little bit tougher to get our heads around. And that's been shifted into another phase 2, the Urukai Working Group activity, which started last month. That activity is chaired by Yasuo Ishihara, who we're very pleased to have in the audience with us. And I apologize, there are a number of speakers who are going to participate at this stage. My microphone, we're a little bit pushed for time, so we're not going to come into the audience and ask for updates and input from you all, but thank you for offering to do so. That Mode 7 will be developed as part of that Urukai Working Group, and by the end of next year, we will have an idea of what that ought to look like, and then how we deal with it, how we get it into our aircraft in the future. So at the moment, we're focusing on this little bit here. How do we deliver these enhanced mode 1 to 6, which will give us 60% of the benefit that we see, or we believe. Each of our OEMs has committed, and they've given us a deployment plan. This is an example of Leonardo's. Matteo, I was going to ask you to talk to this a little bit. You shared it with us in Atlanta, but we're going to have to skip to that. It'd just be good to know, Matteo, are we still on schedule with your plan? Yes, we are. That's fantastic. No, it's good to know. There's a lot of detail on this slide, but I think the thing that we'll point out here is that with Leonardo's involvement, we're going to have... Oh, that's a shame. Sorry, Matteo. Fantastic. That's great. And that's what we want everybody to learn and understand. Huge commitment, huge complexity in this project. That date, the end of this year, is the earliest time when we're likely to be able to see those mode 1 to 6 enhancements available for operators to start to implement, to work out how they're going to implement into their fleets. I'll come back to Alan Warling. Alan Warling, Sikorsky representative this time. This is a program that Alan shared with us. If we look at, I think, this area of the chart here, the end of that red line, that talks to the complicated process of software updates that not only have to go on with the EGPWS module, but also that have to then be integrated into the S92 platform. We're talking about implementing or having these mode 1 to 6 enhancements available to operators by the end of 2020, early 2021. Alan, microphone or not, are we still on schedule?
Yeah, we're still working towards that. Yep. So it'll be in the next AMS software update for the S92, which will be AMS 11.0.
Fantastic.
So,
thanks, Alan.
Yep.
And for completeness, Gilles, I didn't even tell you I was going to come to you, but I was just going to say that we know we've got your plan as well, and I think the key date is here, is that to get these mode 1 to 6 enhancements onto the Airbus fleets, we're looking at Q2 2021. Is that still on schedule, Gilles? Any change? Perfect. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. So if we're going to go along with our idea of practice, that knowing that we've developed the solution, how do we implement? I think it's fairly straightforward for HTORs. Where a solution's available, we ask operators to look at their fleet, develop an installation plan, call out the timescale that's going to be involved to implement an upgrade or support their upgrade plan with a risk assessment. That just means that they can implement at a rate that's appropriate for that operator, but we also have open visibility for the rest of the industry. So if we're summarizing where we are, Honeywell working away with the OEMs to develop their software. That's going to be delivered by the end of this year. Operators on our 2 key fleets, the 139 and the 92, are going to be looking at having this in their hands sometime next year or early in the year after 2021. The Mode 7 enhancements, which are going to be addressed in that phase 2, are several years away. That's a reality for us. So when we look at that status, that's good. It's a hugely complicated exercise to have got this far. There's been great commitment, and it's been a really good exercise for us as an industry. But when we look at that commitment, we understand the status of where we are, and we weigh that off with the risk that we're trying to address here, which is our primary risk of CFIT. I think there's a couple of questions to ask, and maybe we've got some company. This isn't about pointing fingers, and this isn't about saying that anybody's done anything bad here. But how did we, in 2016, as a collective group, set out to achieve 100% of this safety benefit in a 2-year period, and yet 3 years later, we're a year and a half away to delivering about half of it? And that's a question that I think we need to take some time to reflect on. We haven't got time in the presentation this afternoon to open it up to a discussion, but we will open up Pole EV, And we've posed this question. Let's think about the context of how do we at HeliOffshore, as we set our objectives and work towards them, what is it that we propose we do to make ourselves more effective? And we pose the question in the context of the HTools program. What do we propose is required to maintain the desired momentum, in this case, around HTools development and implementation? That Poll EV question is going to stay open for you. We're now going to roll into the last update of our session. So we're going to talk about EBT, a subject which I think has happened largely in the background for the last few years. There has been work going on, but we haven't really talked about it openly. But Pat, can I ask you to come and just briefly give us an idea of why it's important that we standardize or take a standardized approach to training? And then you're going to introduce Phil, who's going to talk about EBT.
When we look at the training of the folks that we're bringing on board and all the recurrent training, one of the things that is a challenge, and I see this challenge with one of the other hats I wear as the chairman of the Helicopter Safety Advisory Conference located in the Gulf of Mexico, is where's the direct guidance on how we're going to bring in all the folks and get them trained? Because I'm sure everyone's seeing now it's greater difficulty to bring in pilots, hire pilots today, as well as mechanics. So we have to have programs that allow efficiency, that can get us operating within the organization, that we're meeting all the standards. And if you look at all the standards that are out there right now, between all the alphabets, HSAC being one of the alphabets, they can be in conflict, and we as operators, we need a direct road to get there. And that's why we look at how can we get more efficient and not be in conflict as we go there. So we need a clear industry-agreed path. And so EBT can be one of those parts of that clear path. They need to be efficient. We need to have the assurances that we're getting the output from the training programs. So they have to have a bit of auditability within them. So the bottom line is we have to come together as an organization, put together plans that we can all agree to, overarching plans, and EBT can be one of those. And the other thing that I learned in wearing my other hat is when I ask people, what the heck is EBT, what the heck is CBT, you get a whole lot of different answers, even myself, until I really started getting into it and having discussions with other experts, trying to figure out what the heck all these plans are. We've been doing them in many ways for many years, but they've not been organized plans so that we can get the greatest efficiencies out of those. So we need to have that in our industry. So we're very happy to have one of those folks here with Phil Cullen, who is an industry expert. He's with the UK CAA, and he's helping to actually standardize that on the fixed wing side, and he brings his expertise to us so that we can start our educational phase to get our teams educated on what these are. So with that, I'd like to bring Phil up to the stage and turn it over to him. So warm welcome, please, to Phil Cullen.
Plenty of time.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Pat, and thank you to HeliOffshore for the invitation to be here. I'm going to talk to you about evidence-based training, but before I do that, may I please ask you a question? If you can put the question up, or do I do that? So, using your Poll EV, can I just ask this question to you in the room, please? How resilient is your organisation? Okay, that's a rhetorical question, and I'll come back to it, and I'll come back to it later. Between 2009 and 2013, some very disturbing accidents were happening in our industry. Actually, I think we could probably roll that time frame to now. Disturbing because these accidents happened to aircraft that could have continued to fly had the correct actions been taken by the crew involved. And I'm certain that many of us talk about resilience. It's a commonly used term, especially in safety-critical industries. And many will ask the question, well, how resilient are we? Well, the simple answer is you don't know. You don't know you're resilient until you have to prove it. So what we're trying to do with EBT is use a set of competencies They're strong indicators to how a crew might react in a certain scenario. And by exposing the pilot to various scenarios, we have the opportunity to predict the strength of those indicators and therefore predict resilience within our crew. Well, in fact, this is what we've set out to do in EBT. So unfortunately, the name is called evidence-based training. It's a competency-based training and assessment system. That's the underlying principle of EBT. We set out on this journey in 2008, and we started looking at over 35,000 points of data between 2008 and 2013. And what that data told us that there were a set of competencies that a pilot needed. There were also several significant training topics that they needed to cover. We then began, from this material, to create a regulatory rule set for that. And this is actually the first in its world, and we began to create that at ARSA. This is where the evidence comes from. 5 years of analysis, and actually the result of that evidence means that we have a set of competencies that are suited to a pilot. The ones you can see in dark were the original 8 competencies from the ICAO and IATA work. That was back in 2013, and since then we began to develop EBT, and we've decided that knowledge, or the application of knowledge, is also another very important competency. The helicopter working group for EBT have also added the fact that monitoring in your industry is extremely important, and therefore that's been identified as another competency. So what does EBT do then? The evidence takes all of this information from accident and incident analysis. It works with a set of competencies on the principle that training a pilot to master a set of competencies in one scenario are transferable into another particular scenario. And it demonstrates that you can apply those competencies in any given situation. Now, our training system hasn't changed for a considerable amount of time. And traditionally, training is about decomposing the job into tasks, ensuring that the pilot is capable of carrying out those tasks. And this was acceptable in a simple operating environment. In Generation 2, that was fine. And yet when we start to look at how our environment is changing, we can see that the sheer number of permutations is increasing. The complexity of the system, the change in our operational environment, and the operational complexity. You could add a fourth dice here, and that would be commercial pressure. To a point that where we are now with Generation 4 aircraft, where we can see that we're facing now unique events that were not previously predicted. Unforeseen causal factors, and therefore we're facing far more of the unexpected. So our training system has to evolve, it has to change, and these are the drivers for it. So what's driving the need for change has been identified over the past 10 years. Aircraft are having accidents where they could have continued to fly. What's driving the need for change is the complexity of the aircraft we have to operate in. And what's driving the need for change are commercial pressures. What's driving the need for change is actually that the future of our industry is in the hands that have a different way of learning. Competency-based training is already widely used in education. In fact, we're playing catch-up here. So what we've done is we've taken all of that information from the data. We've taken all of the information from the data report and produced an evidence-based training program. And in phase 1, I started with chairing at EASA, the rule-making group, which is about getting 12 Europeans in the room and getting them all to try and agree. As a Brit chairing that, you can imagine how difficult that was. So we're at phase 1, we've completed it. We now have a rule set for evidence-based training. And that rule set also has been written in such a way to define the pathway also for helicopters. Phase 2 is up to you. Phase 2 is where you have to produce the data report. From what I hear today, you've already got that data. It involves your application in analysing that data. And then phase 3 is for you to produce your baseline report so that you can begin employing EBT, the competency-based training and assessment system. Over 50 airlines already worldwide are already doing evidence-based training. To help you and facilitate with that, HeliOffshore have very kindly produced a set of workshops that we've been running in London. We've ran the first one we ran was in December, and we run another 2 next week. And these really are workshops where you can understand and take some of the myths away from evidence-based training as being difficult. Evidence-based training is just a competency-based training and assessment system. The change with it is the emphasis on how we look towards the instructor. The instructor now needs to look for observable behaviors rather than just looking at whether somebody carried out a task correctly or not. We're looking at the process, not just the outcome. I think I was going to hand it over to you at this point, Tim, to define your next steps.
Indeed, Phil. And I just want to underline how much we relied on the commitment and the efforts of the fixed wing group as they worked through at EBT to make sure that we, the helicopter community, had an open pathway through regulation, and that's down to Phil and his group for allowing that to happen. So thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it. Yes, indeed, we are about 3 or 4 months away from producing our own data report, and then the baseline program should follow on a year later. So what does that mean? Well, it means that about a year from now, helicopter operators, in Europe at least, whilst the European regulatory system stands up to EBT, a year from now, European regulators could be looking at taking on an EBT program, which is fantastic news. So what was really pleasing about that last slide, by the way, and I want to make this point, is that it was very much a European-centric sort of view, but in fact, I can't go backwards, can I? Or I can go backwards, can I? Maybe I can't go backwards. You'll notice that PHI and Westar were involved in there, so we're moving beyond Europe. We've got involvement from a wider audience, and there's a wider interest set, which is absolutely fantastic. So we've kind of just got back to our time, so let me just summarize. Thank you to everybody for taking us through the update story this afternoon for operational effectiveness. We really ought to recognize the many ongoing collaborative efforts which bear witness to an increasing alignment on all of our safety objectives. So thank you to everybody, those who are here, who've spoken, those who aren't here, those of you who have members in your organizations who contribute on a daily, weekly and monthly basis to our success. It is very much appreciated. We've got to think in terms, going back to Keith's model, we've got to think in terms of moving beyond just driving the technical development change. We've got to talk about effective implementation, and ultimately we have to get to a point where Matt and his HSIP program are able to tell us that we're genuinely succeeding in delivering safety performance improvements to the front line. That's our summary. Thank you very much for listening to all of us.